Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, continuing with the second half of lecture 33. I apologize for the typo. First part of the urinary system. In part A, we talked about the anatomy of the urinary system, the kidneys with their three regions, cortex, medulla, which contains pyramids, and pelvis, the ureters, which peristalse urine down into the urinary bladder, which is a muscular bag, which will then push urine out through the urethra to the outside of the body. So all this talk about urine and where it goes, the question now becomes, what is it? And so if you can kind of think for a minute, we would normally in class do this as a pair share, but what actually is urine and what is in it? So first of all, urine is made by the kidneys. We've talked about that already. And it's where we put all of the stuff that our body doesn't need or want at the moment. So the first category of things that we're going to want to excrete or get rid of are wastes, right? Garbage stuff that we don't want in our body. So urea is in urine. You notice the similarity there. And that's a waste product of amino acid metabolism. Creatinine, which is the breakdown waste product of creatine. So remember when we learned about the creatine phosphate pathway in muscles for energy production. And so when creatine breaks down, it becomes creatinine, which is something that our kidneys then need to excrete. Uric acid, which is a breakdown waste product from nucleic acids, which we are constantly creating and tearing down and rebuilding anew. And ammonia, which is a breakdown waste product from protein metabolism in general. The more protein you eat, or the more proteins you are breaking down for whatever reason, the more ammonia you will have in your body. Our liver turns some of that into urea, but some of it stays as ammonia. So these are all things that we don't want circulating in our bloodstream in high levels, so we're going to use our kidneys to eliminate them. So our first category of substances in the urine is wastes. The second one is water. So urine is liquid, which is really useful. It makes it easy for it to flow and for us to get it out of our body. There are other organisms that have a more solid or gel type urine than we do, but our urine requires decent amounts of water in order for the system to function properly. So of course there's a lot of water in urine, but not just to make it easier for wastes to flow out of our body, but also because that's part of how we regulate our total body water as well as blood pressure and blood volume. So it's really important for our overall fluid homeostasis that in times when we have more water in our system than we need, we can eliminate it through the urine. And at times when we need to hold on to as much water as possible, we also have the ability to do that and release very little of it into the urine. Another component of urine is hydrogen ions, right, which are acidic. And so our kidneys have the capacity to excrete hydrogen ions in the urine in order to get rid of excess acid in our bloodstream. So this is crucially important for homeostasis in terms of maintaining a normal pH in our bloodstream. And this is also a kind of more long-term, slower acting adjustment than respiratory rate. So remember when we learned about diabetic ketoacidosis and how oftentimes when people have really high acid levels in their blood, so low pH in their bloodstream, they will breathe very deeply and rapidly to get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible because carbon dioxide is acidic. So you can regulate your blood pH through your respiratory system, which is really good for moment-to-moment regulation, and it's very quick acting. But if you need something over a longer period of time, then that's where the kidneys come in. Finally, the fourth kind of category of components of the urine are salts or electrolytes, things like sodium and potassium and calcium. So as you've learned, those levels are really important for our bloodstream. So we are going to adjust how much is in our blood by excreting more or less of them into the urine. If you eat a really salty meal, your urine later that day is going to be salty because you don't need that much salt in your bloodstream, right? You are going to passively absorb it from your intestines, and then you have to get rid of it. So sodium is also interesting because it is highly osmotically active, and it is at much higher levels. Our blood has a lot of sodium in it because it's osmotically active. So it's part of how we regulate blood plasma volume, is by what our sodium concentration is. So, and our total body water volume is through our sodium levels. So that one's going to be super important. So overall, our urine is water with a bunch of wastes in it, such as urea, uric acid, ammonia, and creatinine. It also will have more or fewer hydrogen ions in it, depending on what's happening with our blood pH, as well as salts or electrolytes, such as sodium, potassium, and calcium, depending on what those levels are like in our body. So how do we actually make urine? So producing urine is the job of the nephron. So I'm just going to introduce you to the anatomy of the nephron today, and then we're going to move into its physiology in part 2 of the urinary system, lecture 34. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It does all of the jobs needed to make urine. They're microscopic little structures. There's over 1 million of them per kidney, but they are the workhorses of the kidney in terms of filtering the blood and producing urine. So the thing I want you to keep in mind, because I'm going to show you a diagram of a nephron in a minute, it's going to look kind of overwhelming. But so what I want to kind of establish at baseline is that essentially every nephron is a track of 2 tubes running parallel to each other. One, which is blood vessels, for the most part capillaries, okay? And then the other is tubules through which filtrate is moving. Now, so filtrate is the word that we give for basically baby urine. It's not called urine until it's all done, but as we're working on making it, we call it filtrate. So these blood vessels, right, these capillaries run side by side with these tubules containing the filtrate. So some substances are going to move from the bloodstream into the filtrate. Some substances will move from the filtrate into the bloodstream, and we'll talk about how that happens in the next lecture. So as they kind of move along with each other side by side, things can get moved from one compartment, either the blood or the filtrate, to another. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and we're going to go into detail on that image on the left that you see in just a minute. But what I want to highlight here for you first is that this part is going to be found in the renal cortex, that outer rind of the kidney, whereas this part of the nephron is going to be in the renal medulla, and specifically in the renal pyramids. So just kind of to orient yourself. Now we're going to go into more detail on the anatomy of a nephron. So first of all, we have blood coming into the kidney through the renal artery here. It's going to branch into smaller arteries and eventually into an artery called an afferent arteriole. Afferent arteriole. From here, the blood is going to move into the glomerulus, which is a nest of capillaries, right? So the blood is going to move through this nest of capillaries, right? Squiggly, squiggly, squiggly. And then eventually out through the efferent arteriole. So this is weird because we have an arteriole going to a capillary bed that then goes to another arteriole. That's not how it works. Usually it's supposed to go to a venule, but this is a weird special circulatory system. And so we have an arteriole on the other end. From here, the blood is going to continue to travel out into this network of capillaries called peritubular capillaries, through all of these capillaries, and you can see that they're surrounding the beige things, which are tubules, right? I told you they were going to be side by side. So blood is going to move through these capillaries and eventually then come into a venule and then eventually drain through larger and larger veins into the renal vein, which will then take it out to the inferior vena cava. So by the time we get through all of this system, this blood has been filtered. All the things that we want to remove from it, we've removed from it, and now it's ready to go back into the general circulation. So that is how the blood moves through the nephron. So that's one of our two parallel systems of tubes, right? I'm just going to erase those so it's easier then to see the next. So how does the urine move through? Well, so first of all, the filtrate, the baby urine, doesn't form until we get to the glomerulus here. So some fluid with dissolved solutes is going to move out of these capillaries and into Bowman's capsule. So that is where the urine, the filtrate, is first kind of born. It's then going to move into this first part of the tubes called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal meaning nearby, right? So those are the first tubes that it moves into. Convoluted because it's all twisty-turny like this, right? And then the filtrate is going to move down into this loop that you see, this big U-shaped loop called the loop of Henle. Then it's going to ascend, so we have an ascending limb. That first part was the descending limb because it was going down. Now we're ascending, and then we come up into another squiggly tubule, and this one's far away from the glomerulus, so this one is called the distal convoluted tubule. The filtrate moves through and then eventually gets drained into a collecting duct. And the collecting duct is going to receive filtrate, which is now pretty much urine, from lots of other nephrons. Lots of other distal convoluted tubules are going to empty their filtrate into the collecting duct, and then it's going to move from there into the calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, and bladder. So we have two parallel systems of substances moving through tubes. The blood is going to move through the arterioles and the capillaries, and the filtrate is going to move through all of these different tubules. So this is just a review of how that filtrate is first formed. So blood is going to come in through the afferent, AFF, like it has affection for, so it's moving toward the glomerulus. As blood moves through the capillaries in the glomerulus, the filtrate, fluid, water, with solutes dissolved in it, is going to move out into Bowman's capsule and then into the proximal convoluted tubule. That blood is then going to leave through the efferent, think E for exit, arteriole. So to review, the blood is then going to move into the peritubular capillaries. Let's see, up here, and then the vasa recta here, and then eventually a venule and the renal vein and into the inferior vena cava. The filtrate was first formed in the glomerulus with Bowman's capsule, moves into the proximal convoluted tubule, down the descending limb, up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, through the distal convoluted tubule, and then eventually into the collecting duct, and then it'll go to a calyx and then the renal pelvis. This is how you can see how they are kind of side by side, same information. It's really good to draw this out, write this out with arrows, just kind of keep practicing it and know which parts are located next to which parts. So we're going to pick up next time talking about how the nephron actually produces urine now that you have a basic understanding of the nephron anatomy. So far in this first lecture, we've talked about the kidneys with their three different regions, cortex, medulla, and pelvis, the ureters, which peristalse urine into the urinary bladder, which is a muscular bag, which will then squeeze and compress to push the urine out through the urethra. Urine is mostly water with waste such as urea, uric acid, ammonia, and acid, right? Hydrogen ions. as well as electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and calcium, depending on what's happening with our body. And then we talked about how the nephron is two parallel sets, two tubes that kind of run along each other, even though they kind of then get all twisty-turny. So we have the blood going through one system and then the filtrate through the other. And when we talk next time, we'll talk about how things move back and forth from one to the other in order to produce urine.